She dangled from the rafters by her hair, bruised, silent, and forgotten, until a cowboy's knife sliced through the cruelty that bound her. What makes a man take in a stranger like blood? And what kind of past was she running from? The silence in Devil's Hollow had a different quality that evening, the kind that makes horses nervous and sends ravens into flight without cause. Boaz Calder felt it in his bones as he guided his mare through the scattered homesteads, each one darker and more abandoned than the last. He'd been drifting for 3 years now, carrying nothing but his rifle, his regrets, and a photograph he never looked at but couldn't throw away. The sound hit him like a physical blow, a horse screaming in terror, the kind of panicked cry that only comes when an animal witnesses something unnatural. Boaz spurred his mare toward the weathered barn that sat like a crooked tooth against the amber sky, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen in a scream. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his days. She hung from the rafters by her dark hair, twisted into a rope that suspended her barely conscious form 3 feet off the barn floor. Her wrists were bound behind her back with barbed wire that had cut deep enough to paint her arms crimson. Someone had carved words into the beam above her head with deliberate cruelty. Whore of the East. Boaz's hands shook as he drew his knife, his mind flashing to another barn, another fire, another girl he'd failed to save. But this time would be different. This time he wouldn't be too late. Easy now, he whispered, supporting her weight with one arm while sawing through the hair with his blade. I've got you. You're not dying here. She fell into his arms like a broken bird, her breathing shallow and labored. When he touched her shoulder to steady her, she flinched with such violence that he nearly dropped her. Her eyes, what he could see of them, through the swelling and bruises, held the kind of terror that comes from betrayal by those who should have protected her. Boaz shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her trembling form, noting the burns on her arms, the cuts that spoke of systematic torture, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned that survival meant making yourself as small as possible. Someone had tried to break her spirit as thoroughly as they'd broken her body. "Can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that never quite became speech. But her eyes, despite everything that had been done to her, still held a flicker of defiance that told Boaz this woman was a fighter. She'd survived this long against odds that would have killed most people. She just needed someone to give her a reason to keep fighting. If stories like this grip you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay for what happens next, because this one's not what you think. The ride to Boaz's cabin passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft whimpers that escaped the woman's lips whenever his mare stumbled on the rocky trail. He'd fashioned a makeshift bed in his hay wagon, cushioning her as best he could with horse blankets and his spare shirt, but every bump in the road seemed to cause her fresh agony. Devil's Hollow stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, a canyon town that decent folk avoided after sunset, where the shadows held too many secrets and the wind carried sounds that might have been screams. But it was isolated, defensible, and far enough from civilization that whoever had done this to her would have trouble finding them. Boaz's cabin sat on the eastern rim of the hollow, a modest structure he'd built with his own hands from timber he'd cut himself. It wasn't much to look at, but it was solid, secure, and stocked with enough supplies to weather a siege if necessary. He learned the value of preparation during his years of running from a past that refused to stay buried. Inside, he laid her on his own bed and lit every lamp he owned, needing the light to assess the full extent of her injuries. His hands trembled as he cleaned the cuts on her wrists with whiskey and water, each flinch and whimper feeling like an accusation. He'd been trained as a field medic during the war, but treating strangers on a battlefield was different from tending to someone whose pain felt personal. The burns on her arms formed a pattern, deliberate marks that spoke of ritualistic torture rather than random violence. Someone had taken their time with her and had enjoyed her suffering. The thought made Boaz's jaw clench with a fury he hadn't felt since the night his sister died. "What's your name?" he asked softly, wrapping clean bandages around her wrists. "I know you can hear me. You don't have to be afraid anymore." For long minutes, she remained silent, staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to be looking at something far beyond the wooden beams. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and raw from screaming. "Junia," she said, the word falling from her lips like a prayer. "My name is Junia." Boaz nodded, filing the name away like a precious thing. Junia, that's a strong name. Biblical. Means youthful, if I remember right. The ghost of a smile flickered across her swollen features. My mother. She said it meant God's gift. Said I was her miracle baby, born when she thought she was too old for children. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Boaz said, securing the last bandage. She'd be proud of how strong you've been. Junia's eyes filled with tears that she seemed too exhausted to shed. She's dead now. They're all dead. And it's my fault. Dawn came gray and cold over Devil's Hollow, painting the landscape in shades of ash and shadow. Boaz left Junia sleeping in his cabin, her breathing finally steady and deep, and rode back to the barn where he'd found her. Something about the scene nagged at him. Details his adrenaline-fueled rescue had caused him to miss the night before. The barn belonged to a homestead that had been abandoned for years, its fields choked with weeds, and its house slowly collapsing under the weight of neglect. But someone had been using it recently. Fresh horse droppings near the entrance, new scratches in the dirt floor, and most telling of all, the strong smell of kerosene that lingered despite the night's wind. Boaz dismounted and began a systematic search, his trained eye cataloging evidence like pieces of a puzzle. In the far corner, hidden beneath a pile of moldy hay, he found the remains of a fire. Not random kindling, but burned papers and what looked like the remnants of journals or letters. Someone had tried to destroy evidence, but they'd been in too much of a hurry to do it properly. He sifted through the ashes with a stick, revealing fragments of writing in a feminine hand. Most of it was illegible, consumed by flame, but a few words survived. I told them the truth about, and won't let them silence. And most chilling of all, and if something happens to me, look for. The blood on the barn floor told its own story. Too much blood, spread in patterns that suggested Junia had been tortured here for hours, maybe days. But there were other stains too, older ones, darker ones that spoke of previous victims. This wasn't the first time this barn had been used for such purposes. Boot prints in the soft earth outside led toward Blackbone Ridge, the meandering trail that connected Devil's Hollow to the larger towns beyond. Boaz counted at least 3 different sets of tracks, all heading in the same direction. The men who'd done this hadn't bothered to cover their trail. They'd expected their victim to die and take her secrets with her. The ride to the nearest settlement took him through territory he'd hoped never to see again. Gritty Creek was barely a town, just a collection of ramshackle buildings that served travelers too desperate or too poor for better accommodations. The kind of place where questions weren't asked and strangers weren't remembered, but the reaction he got when he mentioned finding an injured woman told him everything he needed to know. The blacksmith suddenly found urgent work that required his immediate attention. The saloon girl developed a case of selective deafness. Even the local preacher crossed the street to avoid conversation. Fear hung over Gritty Creek like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. These people knew something about what had happened to Junia, but they were too terrified to speak. Someone with power, someone with influence, had made it clear that silence was the price of continued good health. As Boaz prepared to leave, an old woman grabbed his sleeve near the general store. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her eyes bright with desperate urgency. "You found her, didn't you?" she whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "The girl they took. Is she alive?" Boaz nodded carefully. "She's safe." "Thank God," the woman breathed. "They said she died screaming, said it was God's judgment for her sins. But I knew better. I knew what really happened to her." The nightmare took Junia like a flash flood in the desert. Sudden, violent, and completely overwhelming. Boaz jerked awake to the sound of her screams echoing through his cabin, a raw, primal sound that spoke of terror beyond imagination. He grabbed the lantern from his bedside table and rushed to her side, finding her thrashing against blankets that had become restraints in her sleeping mind. "Junia," he called softly, setting the lantern down and reaching toward her carefully. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. No one can hurt you here." Her eyes snapped open, wild and unseeing, still trapped in whatever hell her subconscious had dragged her back to. For a moment, she didn't recognize him, saw only another threat, another source of pain. She scrambled backward against the headboard, her hands raised defensively, fresh blood seeping through the bandages on her wrists. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Please don't. I'll be good. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt me anymore." The words hit Boaz like physical blows, each plea a testament to the systematic breaking of her spirit. He lowered himself slowly into the chair beside her bed, making sure his hands remained visible and non-threatening. "Nobody's going to hurt you," he said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "You're under my protection now, and I give you my word, my solemn oath, that no one will lay a hand on you again while I draw breath." It took nearly an hour for the terror to fade from her eyes, for her breathing to slow from panicked gasps to something approaching normal. Boaz sat with her through it all, talking in low, soothing tones about inconsequential things: the weather, the horses, the way morning light painted the canyon walls gold. When she finally seemed ready to talk, the story came out in fragments, like pieces of broken glass that cut her as she spoke them. She'd been traveling with a religious group, pilgrims heading west to establish a new settlement where they could practice their faith without interference. They trusted their leader, a charismatic preacher who spoke of God's love and Christian charity. "They said I was a temptress," Junia whispered, her hands twisting the blanket into knots. "Said I led men astray with my sinful nature. When I tried to defend myself, they called it pride. When I cried, they called it manipulation. Everything I did was twisted into evidence of my corruption." Boaz felt his jaw clench. He'd seen religious fanatics before, men who used faith as a weapon and scripture as a justification for their own twisted desires. "What did they say you did wrong?" "I refused him," she said simply. "Brother Hollis said God had revealed to him that I was to be his third wife, that it was my duty to submit to his spiritual authority. When I said no, when I told him I'd rather die than marry him, he decided that was exactly what should happen." The pieces clicked into place in Boaz's mind. The ritual nature of her torture, the words carved into the beam, the systematic attempt to break her will before ending her life. This hadn't been random violence. It had been an execution disguised as religious purification. "Why did you help me?" Junia asked suddenly, her voice small and uncertain. "You don't know me. I could be everything they said I was. I could be—" "Because," Boaz interrupted, thinking of another girl, another barn, another fire that had consumed everything he'd ever loved. "No one helped my sister when she needed it most, and I've been living with that failure every day since." Bitterhook squatted on the prairie like a diseased tick, its buildings weathered gray by wind and neglect, its streets empty of everything except dust and broken dreams. Boaz rode in just after noon, when the sun was high enough to cast short shadows, but not hot enough to drive people indoors. It was the kind of town where strangers were noticed, remembered, and often regretted visiting. The saloon was called the Hanged Man, a name that struck Boaz as unnecessarily ominous, even by frontier standards. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. A handful of patrons nursed their drinks in silence, their eyes following Boaz's movement, with the wariness of men who'd learned that curiosity could be deadly. "Looking for information about a preacher named Hollis Veer," Boaz announced to the room in general, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Heard he used to run revival meetings in these parts." The silence that followed was so complete that Boaz could hear his own heartbeat. Then, slowly, one by one, the patrons found reasons to leave. Sudden appointments, forgotten chores, urgent business that couldn't wait another minute. Within 5 minutes, the saloon was empty except for Boaz and the bartender, a nervous man with thinning hair and shifty eyes. "Don't know anybody by that name," the bartender lied, polishing the same glass over and over. "Might try asking at the church. Preacher folk tend to know each other." But Boaz had seen the recognition in the man's eyes, the involuntary flinch when Veer's name was mentioned. These people knew exactly who he was talking about. They were just too frightened to admit it. The blacksmith shop told the same story. Tom Bradshaw, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks, suddenly developed a stutter and a case of selective amnesia when Boaz asked about recent strangers passing through town. His hammer rang against the anvil with increasing urgency, as if the sound could drown out unwanted questions. Lots of folks come through, Bradshaw mumbled, not meeting Boaz's eyes. Can't keep track of 'em all. Mind your own business. That's what keeps a man breathing steady in these parts. The pattern repeated itself throughout Bitterhook. Shopkeepers found urgent inventory to count. Children were hurried indoors by nervous mothers. Even the town's prostitutes, women who usually welcomed any distraction from their daily routine, crossed the street to avoid conversation. It wasn't until Boaz reached the sheriff's office that he found someone willing to talk, though Marshal Cade Renshaw's willingness came with its own set of warning signs. The lawman was too smooth, too helpful, his smile too wide, and his manner too accommodating. Everything about him screamed danger. Hollis Veer, Renshaw mused, leaning back in his chair with studied casualness. Name sounds familiar. Preacher, you said? We get a lot of traveling ministers through here. Hard to keep them all straight. This one would be memorable, Boaz said, watching the marshal's face carefully. The kind who believes in harsh discipline for sinners, especially women. Something flickered behind Renshaw's eyes. Recognition, calculation, maybe even approval. Well now, that does narrow it down some. Are you a friend of his? Because if you are, I might have some information that could be useful. The offer was clearly a test, a way of determining which side Boaz was on. The wrong answer would likely result in a bullet in the back before he reached the edge of town. I'm looking for him, Boaz said carefully, because he hurt someone I care about. Someone who didn't deserve what happened to her. Renshaw's smile faded, replaced by something cold and predatory. Friend, you might want to be real careful about the accusations you throw around. Hollis Veer is a man of God, doing the Lord's work in a godless world. If some sinful woman got herself punished, well, maybe she had it coming. Junia's recovery came in small victories that meant everything. The morning she sat up without help, Boaz felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was wound tight. When she walked to the window under her own power, he had to turn away to hide the relief in his eyes. And the day she actually laughed at something silly he'd said while tending the horses, he knew she was going to survive more than just her physical injuries. But survival and living were two different things, and Boaz was determined to give her back the power that had been stolen from her. He started by teaching her to shoot, setting up targets against the canyon wall, and patiently correcting her stance, her grip, her breathing. Her hands shook at first, muscle memory of helplessness, making it hard to hold the weapon steady. I can't, she said after missing her fifth shot in a row, frustration bringing tears to her eyes. I'm too weak, too broken. You're not broken, Boaz said firmly, moving behind her to adjust her arm position. You're healing. There's a difference. The strength was always there. It just got buried under all the pain. We're digging it back out. By the end of the week, she could put 3 shots in a playing card at 20 paces. By the end of the second week, she was out shooting him more often than not. But more important than her marksmanship was the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, head high, eyes that no longer flinched from every shadow. They fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Junia tended the fire and prepared meals with ingredients from Boaz's well-stocked pantry. She mended his clothes with neat, precise stitches that spoke of a genteel upbringing before her world had turned violent. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked, carefully at first, then with growing openness as trust replaced wariness. Junia told him about her life before the Pilgrims, about the small town in Ohio where she'd been the school teacher, respected and independent. She spoke of her dreams of starting a school for girls in the West, where young women could learn not just to read and write, but to think for themselves, to stand up for what was right. Boaz shared his own stories more reluctantly, his service in the war, the farm he'd tried to build afterward, the sister who died in a fire while he was away chasing fool's gold in the mountains. The guilt that had driven him to become a drifter, moving from town to town because staying in one place meant forming connections he was sure he'd eventually fail. It was during one of these evening conversations that they heard the horses approaching. Boaz was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Junia to get behind the table. But instead of riders, they found something worse. A message nailed to his door with a railroad spike, the paper fluttering in the night wind like a wounded bird. The words were written in the same hand that had carved the sign above Junia's head. You took what was judged. Return her or burn. Boaz crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw set in lines that promised violence. Well then, he said, checking the loads in his rifle, let's see how they burn. That night, Junia couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with her own rifle across her knees, watching the darkness for signs of movement. They'll come for me, she said quietly. They won't give up. Brother Hollis believes God speaks directly to him, tells him what to do, and God apparently wants me dead. Then God can come and take you himself, Boaz replied, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that had once led men into battle. Because I'll be damned if I let any earthly messenger lay a finger on you. Brother Hollis Veer held court in the back room of Bitterhook's only hotel, his presence commanding attention like a force of nature. He was younger than Boaz had expected, maybe 40, with prematurely silver hair and eyes that burned with the fervor of absolute certainty. But it was his hands that drew the eye, specifically the scarred cross burned into his right palm, a mark he displayed prominently as proof of his devotion. Brother, Veer greeted Boaz with a smile that never reached his eyes. I understand you've been asking questions about me throughout our fair town. I thought perhaps we should speak directly, man to man, about whatever concerns you might have. Boaz remained standing while Veer gestured toward an empty chair, recognizing the power play for what it was. The preacher was surrounded by half a dozen followers, hard men with the look of enforcers rather than believers, their hands never far from their weapons. I found something that belongs to you, Boaz said, his voice level and controlled. A woman, or what was left of her after your people finished their spiritual counseling. Veer's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Ah, yes, poor Sister Junia. I had hoped she'd found peace at last. Her torment was considerable. The demons that possessed her fought most vigorously against the Lord's cleansing fire. Funny thing about demons, Boaz replied, his hand drifting toward his gun. They tend to look a lot like men when you see them up close. Men with ropes and knives and twisted ideas about what God wants from his children. You blaspheme, Veer said, his voice taking on the rolling cadence of a practiced orator. Sister Junia was given every opportunity to confess her sins, to accept the judgment of her betters, to submit to God's will as revealed through his chosen vessel. She chose defiance instead. She chose corruption over redemption. Boaz felt the familiar cold rage settling over him like a comfortable coat. And what exactly were her sins, preacher? Refusing to marry a man she despised? Saying no when you tried to force yourself on her? Teaching children to read instead of keeping them ignorant and obedient? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder charge. Veer's followers shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons, but their leader raised a calming hand. When he spoke again, his voice carried the absolute conviction of a man who'd convinced himself that his desires were divinely inspired. Women are weak vessels, Veer intoned, easily corrupted by their own sinful nature. They require strong guidance, firm discipline, and complete submission to male authority. Sister Junia had been poisoned by the world's lies about equality and independence. We sought only to free her from these delusions. By hanging her from a barn rafter, by showing her the consequences of rebellion against God's natural order. Sometimes the flesh must be mortified before the spirit can be saved. It's unfortunate that her willfulness proves stronger than her capacity for redemption. Boaz studied the preacher's face, seeing not madness, but something worse, absolute certainty in his own righteousness. Men like Veer were more dangerous than any outlaw because they believed their cruelty was sanctified, their violence blessed by divine mandate. Here's the thing about divine mandate, Boaz said, taking a step closer to Veer's chair. Sometimes God sends his own angels to deliver justice, and sometimes those angels carry Colt revolvers and know how to use them. The threat was unmistakable, and Veer's followers responded by drawing their guns. But Boaz had expected this, had planned for it. His own weapon was already in his hand, the barrel pointed steadily at the preacher's forehead. "Judge another woman like that," Boaz said quietly, "and you'll meet your maker sooner than you planned. And when you do, you might find he's got some questions about what you've been doing in his name." The flames reached for the sky like desperate fingers, turning Boaz's cabin into a beacon, visible for miles across the dark prairie. He and Junia had barely escaped through the back window, grabbing nothing but their weapons and the clothes on their backs as fire consumed everything they'd built together. "The mine shaft!" Boaz shouted over the roar of burning timber, pulling Junia toward the abandoned silver mine that honeycombed the canyon walls. "We can hide there until dawn, figure out our next move." The old workings provided shelter, but little comfort. They huddled together in the darkness, watching through the entrance as their sanctuary burned to nothing but ash and memory. Junia shook with more than cold, her hard-won recovery cracking under the weight of renewed persecution. "They'll never stop," she whispered, her voice small and broken. "As long as I'm alive, as long as I'm free, they'll keep coming. Maybe I should just—" "Don't," Boaz interrupted, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Don't even think about it. Running away, giving up. That's what they want. They want you to believe you're powerless, that resistance is futile. But you're not the same woman they strung up in that barn. You're stronger now. We both are." As the fire died down to glowing embers, Junia began to talk, really talk, for the first time since her rescue. The words came out in a torrent, as if the flames had burned away her last defenses against the truth. She told him about the wagon train, about how Brother Veer had seemed so kind and godly at first, offering protection and community to those seeking new lives in the West. How gradually his sermons had turned darker, more controlling, focused on the dangers of female independence and the need for absolute submission to male authority. He called them purification ceremonies, Junia said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Public trials where women were accused of sins they'd never committed: pride, lust, rebellion against God's natural order. The punishments got worse as time went on: whippings, brandings, isolation in wooden boxes under the desert sun. Boaz felt sick listening to the systematic torture disguised as religious instruction. Why didn't anyone try to stop him? "Some did," Sarah Whitmore spoke up when he started targeting the younger girls. "They found her body 3 days later and said she'd been killed by Indians. But I saw the marks on her throat. Those weren't arrow wounds." Junia's hands clenched into fists. "That's when I knew I had to get away. But Veer caught me trying to steal a horse. Said my attempted escape proved my corruption, that God demanded the ultimate purification." "Your crime wasn't theft," Boaz realized. "It was bearing witness. You could expose him, tell people what really happened to those women." He knew I'd seen too much, knew too much. The hanging was meant to be my confession, a public admission of guilt before my execution. But when the hair tore and I fell, Junia touched the tender spot on her scalp where chunks of hair had been ripped out by the roots. He told everyone I died screaming for forgiveness, that my death was proof of God's justice. Boaz understood now why Veer wanted her back so desperately. A dead martyr was useful for his narrative. A living witness was dangerous beyond measure. "Tomorrow," he said, checking his rifle in the dim light filtering through the mine entrance, "we're going back to Bitterhook. No more running, no more hiding. If Veer wants a reckoning, we'll give him one. But this time, the whole town is going to hear your story." "They won't listen," Junia protested. "They're too afraid of him." "Then we'll make them listen. And if fear is what keeps them silent, maybe it's time they learned there are worse things to be afraid of than one mad preacher and his gang of thugs." They rode into Bitterhook at high noon like avenging angels. Junia sitting straight backed in the saddle despite her exhaustion, her rifle across her knees and fire in her eyes. The town square was crowded with people conducting their daily business, but conversations died as they recognized the woman who was supposed to be dead. Brother Veer emerged from the hotel like a spider sensing vibrations in his web, his face cycling through surprise, rage, and calculation before settling on righteous indignation. "Behold," he called out in his booming preacher's voice, "the wages of sin made manifest. The demon has returned to corrupt our righteous community. But his usual authority rang hollow now, his words lacking the power they'd once held over the frightened townspeople. Junia dismounted with deliberate calm, walking to the center of the square, where everyone could see her clearly. The burns on her arms were visible, the marks of her torture undeniable even to those who'd convinced themselves she deserved her fate. "I am Junia," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "You all know who I am, though Brother Veer told you I was dead. He told you I died screaming for forgiveness, admitting my sins before God's judgment. But I'm here to tell you the truth about what really happened to me and to the other women who've disappeared from your midst." Marshal Renshaw stepped forward, his hand on his gun, clearly intending to stop this public revelation before it could gain momentum. But Boaz was ready for him, his own weapon drawn and aimed before the corrupt lawman could clear leather. "The lady's talking," Boaz said quietly. "Seems like the polite thing to do would be to listen." Junia began to speak, her words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. She told him about the wagon train, about the systematic abuse disguised as spiritual guidance, about women who'd questioned Veer's authority and mysteriously disappeared or died in accidents shortly thereafter. "Sarah Whitmore didn't die from Indian arrows," Junia declared, looking directly at the preacher. "She was strangled for trying to protect the younger girls from his twisted appetites. Martha Crenshaw didn't fall into that ravine. She was pushed after refusing to submit to public humiliation for the crime of speaking her mind." The crowd stirred uneasily, recognizing names, remembering faces. These weren't nameless strangers Junia was talking about. These were women they'd known, women whose deaths they'd accepted without question because a man of God had explained them away. "And what was my great sin?" Junia continued, her voice rising with passion. "What crime demanded that I be tortured, humiliated, and executed? I refused to marry him. I said no when he claimed God had revealed I should be his third wife. I chose my own path instead of submitting to his authority." Veer finally found his voice, stepping forward with the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Lies," he thundered. "Desperate fabrications from a woman whose mind has been twisted by demons. She seeks only to avoid the just consequences of her rebellion against God's natural order." "Then let God himself judge between us," Junia shot back. "But do it in the light of day, with the whole community as witness, not in secret where your sins can be hidden behind closed doors and justified by twisted scripture." The challenge hung in the air like the smell of an approaching storm. Veer looked around the square, seeking support from his followers, but found only uncertain faces and wavering faith. His power had always depended on fear and isolation, on controlling information and crushing opposition before it could spread. When he lunged toward Junia with a knife hidden in his sleeve, Boaz was ready. The shot echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder, and Veer dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder, his weapon spinning away across the dusty ground. "I could have killed you," Boaz said, his rifle already reloaded and aimed. "But dead martyrs have a way of inspiring more trouble than live cowards. So you get to live, but your days of judging other people are over." The wounded preacher staggered to his feet, his face twisted with pain and rage. "This isn't finished," he snarled, pressing his good hand against the bleeding wound. "God's justice cannot be denied forever." "Then let him deliver it himself next time," Boaz replied coldly. "But if I ever hear of you laying hands on another woman, I'll put the next bullet somewhere, a lot more permanent." Veer retreated toward his horse, his remaining followers helping him mount despite his injury. As they rode out of Bitterhook, the townspeople watched in stunned silence, finally understanding the kind of man they'd allowed to terrorize their community. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the ridge where Boaz and Junia had built their new life. The cabin was larger than the one that had burned, with extra rooms for the school Junia had always dreamed of establishing. Young girls from across the territory came to learn not just reading and arithmetic, but confidence, self-respect, and the radical idea that their voices mattered. Junia stood in the doorway, watching her students practice their marksmanship, a skill she insisted was as important as penmanship for young women growing up in a world that often tried to silence them. Her scars had faded but never disappeared entirely, serving as reminders of how far she'd come, rather than symbols of what had been taken from her. "Letter came for you," Boaz said, approaching with a worn envelope in his weathered hands. He'd adapted surprisingly well to his role as both protector and partner in Junia's educational mission, teaching the practical skills while she handled the academic subjects. The letter was from a woman in Kansas, one of many who'd heard about the school and wanted to send her daughter west for an education that emphasized strength alongside scholarship. Word was spreading through informal networks of mothers and wives who understood that the world was changing, that their daughters would need different skills than previous generations. 15 more applications this month, Junia mused, scanning the letter's contents. We'll need to expand again soon. Boaz nodded, already mentally designing additional classrooms and dormitory space. Bitterhook's been asking about sending some of their girls too. Amazing how attitudes change when people start thinking for themselves instead of letting others do it for them. The transformation of Bitterhook had been gradual but profound. With Veer gone, he'd fled west after his shoulder healed, his authority broken, and his followers scattered. The town had slowly begun to remember what the community was supposed to look like. Marshal Renshaw had been replaced by a deputy who actually enforced the law, rather than selectively interpreting it. As evening approached, Boaz found himself at the small cemetery he'd established on the hill behind the cabin. The single grave there bore a simple wooden marker: Sarah Calder, beloved sister, 1851 to 1873. He knelt beside it as he did every week, pulling weeds and straightening the wildflowers Junia had planted around the headstone. I couldn't save you, he said quietly, his voice carrying words he'd never been able to speak before. I was too far away, too caught up in my own dreams to see the danger you were in. But I saved her, Sarah. I saved Junia, and she's saving others now. Maybe that doesn't balance the scales, but it's something. The wind through the pine trees sounded almost like laughter, and for a moment Boaz could almost believe his sister approved of the path he'd chosen. He'd spent 3 years running from his guilt, convincing himself that he was too broken to protect anyone. But sometimes the most damaged people made the best guardians, because they understood the cost of failure. Papa Boaz, came a young voice from the cabin below. One of Junia's students, a spirited 8-year-old named Mary, whose mother had sent her west to escape an abusive father, came running up the hill with something clutched in her small hands. The title still surprised him. He and Junia weren't married in any legal sense, but they'd become family in all the ways that mattered. The students had started calling him Papa Boaz and her Mama Junia, creating their own definitions of what a family could be. Look what I made, Mary announced, thrusting a carefully carved wooden horse toward him. Miss Junia taught me how to use the knife safely, and I made this for you. Boaz accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved, examining the careful craftsmanship with professional appreciation. That's fine work, Mary. Your mother's going to be proud when she sees what you've learned. I'm going to make one for Mama Junia too, Mary declared, and maybe a whole herd, so they won't be lonely. As the child skipped back down the hill, Boaz reflected on how the definition of family had evolved on this ridge. They'd created something unprecedented, a household built on choice rather than blood, on shared purpose rather than legal obligation. Junia had her school, he had his workshop where he taught practical skills, and together they'd built a sanctuary for young women who needed to learn they were worth protecting. The sound of the dinner bell drew him back to the cabin, where Junia was herding her students toward the long table they'd built to accommodate their growing household. She caught his eye across the crowded room and smiled. Not the broken, haunted expression he'd first seen in that barn, but something radiant with possibility and strength. Family, she called out, raising her glass of cider, let us give thanks for second chances, for the courage to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed, and for learning that sometimes the greatest acts of faith involve believing in each other. The toast was echoed by a dozen young voices, each representing a different story of survival and hope. Boaz raised his own glass, thinking of the woman who'd hung from a barn rafter 6 months ago, and the community of fierce, independent spirits she'd become. She was never a victim again. None of them were. If you thought this was powerful, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.